Hey everybody, welcome to today's episode of my Musical Moment series. Today we are talking about Handel's Messiah. And no, it is not the Messiah, it is just Messiah. No article needed, just Messiah. Hallelujah. Yes, that one. We think of that as the quintessential holiday piece for Christmas time, etc. But it turns out maybe not the most historically accurate to do it that time of year, so stick around. That's right, so today we are talking about Handel's Messiah, and when the traditional time to perform it actually is. You can guess from the title today, it is not traditional to perform it during the holiday season in December, but it was actually written to be performed and traditionally performed during Holy Week, the week of Easter. And so I thought we'd actually look a little bit at Messiah and its history and Handel's story so we could understand how that happened and how it got switched over to December later on in history. So we're going to begin by jumping way back. This is to 1685 when Handel was born. And if you're a particularly astute viewer, maybe you're like, wait a minute, 1685, isn't that the year that Bach was born? Yes, it was. These two incredibly important Baroque composers, arguably the two best-known Baroque composers, born the same year, and gosh, their careers could not have been more different. On the one hand, we have Bach, who pretty much stayed in the same area his entire life, worked for the church almost exclusively for his entire life, and then the enterprising Handel, who went where the work was, where the best work was and the most lucrative work was. Now, Handel's father was a surgeon, and did I mention this was in 1685? Can you imagine what being a surgeon in 1685 must have been like? Yikes. Now, in fairness to them, this was after the Enlightenment, so it wasn't like he was a barber and a surgeon, but still, 1685, I'm not doing elective surgery. If it's me, in 1685. But he's like, I don't want my son to be a musician. I want him to go into something practical, like being a lawyer. But obviously the young Handel was so talented, wrote his first opera before the age of 18, and it was produced in Hamburg, so there was clearly some incredible talent there. He, the enterprising young composer that he was, goes off to Italy to study Italian opera because that's where the best Italian opera was being done. And he worked in several cities in Italy for a couple of years, learned all about it, became a great composer of Italian opera, brought some of that expertise back to Germany, worked a little bit there. But the enterprising composer that he is, he saw an opportunity. At 27, he moves to London. And he moved to London to do Italian opera. Because you may not think it, but actually there was a huge demand for Italian opera in London around that time. So he moves there and becomes one of the most celebrated composers of Italian opera in London. Kind of strange, but not bad for a German guy, right? So we had this circuitous route there from Germany to Italy, now on to London, where he becomes incredibly famous. Now, at the time, there was actually a big rivalry between two different groups of Italian opera lovers. So on the one hand, you had people who thought Handel was the greatest Italian opera composer, and on the other hand, you had this other guy who was actually Italian, this guy Bononcini. And everybody who loved Italian opera in London was in one camp or the other. And there was this big rivalry. I think it was mostly a friendly rivalry between the two composers, but their supporters, some of it got pretty heated, and they would write poetry about the other person. One of the famous rhymes was that Bononcini cannot hold a candle to Handel. See, it rhymes. Clever that way. But yeah, so there were these two different camps, and in London at the time, it was epically huge and getting bigger all the time. So the sets were getting bigger, the costumes were getting bigger, the orchestras were getting bigger, and singers were often imported from Italy as well because, well, there was there was a bit of snobbery in London at the time that in order to sing Italian opera great, you had to have been trained in Italy. So they were spending more and more money on these sets, on these costumes, on these singers who would come with these greater and greater budgets, greater and greater fees, and yes, even greater and greater egos. So over the course of time, audiences became used to greater and greater spectacle. Sort of like the Marvel movies of today, it was just like these grand special effects and bigger on stage, and with that came bigger and bigger budgets. But these things couldn't run for years and years like things on Broadway today. So the economics of it became difficult to sustain. And producers started saying, I can't spend all this money on sets, costumes, orchestra, composer, singers from Italy. It didn't make sense from an economic point of view. And when that happened, there was a big change for composers. Did I mention that Handel was quite the enterprising young composer? Because he saw this happening and he said, I need to change what I'm working on because I'm not going to be able to make money writing these huge Italian operas anymore. So he turned his attention to oratorio. And oratorio still had these grand stories, but people didn't expect a set. People didn't expect costumes. It was basically like an in-concert performance of a story. And in many cases, these were religious texts. There were the sources for these stories, so the audiences were already familiar with them. They kind of got it. They knew where it was going, and so composing the story wasn't as intense in some ways because you didn't have to lead the audience through it in quite the same way. You could kind of say, well, I'm going to hit these big moments, and the audience was already there with you on this. So this is what Handel started writing, and they were enormously successful, and Messiah was number 6. This particular one was not performed or premiered in London. Instead, it was premiered in Dublin, and this was part of a benefit. Handel, his whole life, performed many of his concerts as benefits for different kinds of organizations, for orphans, for hospitals, and in particular, this one for debtors' prison. So his idea was to do this concert in Dublin as a benefit. Now, lots have been said about the fact that Handel wrote this in 24 days. And 3 hours of music in 24 days is very impressive by today's standards. And at the end of the score, he wrote, to the glory of God, or all this is for the glory of God. And so lots of people said, oh, he was so inspired that he wrote this in record time. Now, he may have been inspired, certainly, because there's some wonderful music, but it really wasn't record time, and certainly not record time for him. It turns out most of the things that he wrote at a similar pace. In fact, just a few days after finishing Messiah, he went on to his next oratorio and started writing it, which was Samson. And then he started scheduling concerts. So he was in Dublin this whole time, and throughout the whole year, because I think he finished in September, and he had a series of concerts going on in Dublin for the rest of the fall and in through the spring. They did not include Messiah. He saved Messiah for April, for Holy Week that year, because he thought that was the best place for it to fit. And you may not know this about Messiah, but it's actually arranged in 3 different parts. The first part is about the prophecy and eventually the story of the birth of Jesus, mostly taken from the book of Luke, Gospel of Luke. So that's part 1. Part 2 of the Messiah is about his life, his death, and resurrection. So that's the whole Easter story, essentially. And then part 3, sort of a more general Christianity and its influence in the world and the ultimate resurrection of all Christians. So that's kind of part 3, and you have these very clear parts. So the bulk of the story there in part 2 is all about Holy Week. So we have Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter. All of that's in part 2, and you can see how Handel thought, well, that's the perfect time to do this piece. So he waited through the whole year and saved this piece, this premiere, for that performance in Dublin in April of that year. The premiere was the event of the year. Huge crowd came in, 700 people, which basically packed the place out. It was so full, in fact, so many tickets were sold, that they sent a letter to everybody who was attending that night and said, ladies, please do not wear your hoop skirts tonight, because if you all wear your hoop skirts, there will not be room for the entire audience. They said, men, please do not wear your swords tonight, because if you wear your swords, they're just going to be in the way because we're going to be so crowded. I myself have had to send similar letters out to our audience, say, men, please do not wear your swords tonight. I wish that was a problem we had, because that would be colorful, to say the least. But a huge success, and the evening was a gigantic financial success as well. Everybody loved it. The people who bought tickets to it, it was an enormous success for those organizations that he was benefiting. In fact, 142 men got out of debtor's prison because of this event. It was just a sensation. Everybody loved it. So you think, oh, well, let's take that. Now it's been a hit in Dublin. Let's move it to London and make a whole bunch of money. Well, that's not exactly what happened. First of all, Handel waited a whole year to present it in London because he believed so strongly the time to present this piece was Holy Week. So he waited around until the following April to present it in London. The premiere in London was not quite as successful. A couple of reasons for that. One is they actually presented it at Covent Garden, which is still today an opera house. And some people thought it was not the appropriate setting for a sacred cantata like that. People said, opera should be done here, but if you're going to do religious texts, you should do those in a church or a cathedral or something, maybe not do it at the opera house, which was really for, secular work. So much so was this an issue that Handel didn't even announce the name of it. He didn't say it was called Messiah. He just said it was called a sacred oratorio because he thought if people know that it's Messiah, they're really going to be put off by the fact that we're doing it at Covent Garden. The other issue is that some of the singers who were soloists were some of those same singers from Italian opera years and years before, and people thought that was inappropriate for them who had played some of these really, really colorful characters to now be playing angels in this, and it just seemed like poor casting. And so because of that, it didn't sell as well. People thought that was the wrong place, and people who did come, they were uncomfortable with some of the choices that Handel had made in terms of cast, etc., and where it was performed. But over the next couple of years, it began to grow in popularity. And that is where we find it today. Now, one of the reasons it grew was because during the Victorian era, there was an explosion of choral societies in all of these towns throughout England. And so lots of towns were starting their little choruses, and they needed repertoire to perform, and they loved singing these oratorios. Now, Messiah in particular has a very interesting choral part. Some of the oratorios, the choir doesn't do a whole lot. It's mostly just the soloists. That is not the case here, and that's one of the reasons that they kept being performed more and more, and these choral societies kept getting larger and larger. And that's when you start to hear these stories of performances that were, 100 people in the chorus, 200 people. One of the first performances in New York City had 300 in the choir. One of the first performances in Boston had 500, and there is even a story about a performance in London with 800 singers and 500 people in the orchestra. That was probably very, very loud. This was such an issue, in fact, that George Bernard Shaw, he even wrote, maybe before I die, I could hear like a well-rehearsed and polished performance of Messiah, because it might actually be very moving, instead of these like, let's just sing this thing. So there's a little bit of a editorial there from that. So you get the idea that these performances were still getting bigger and bigger. Now, as recently as 1900, this was still considered to be a Holy Week piece. The vast majority of performances that we find were still performed during April or March, depending on when Easter actually fell that year. But after 1900 is when we begin to see things change a little bit. And that's when people said, wait a minute, the fact of the matter is that Easter season is really only 3 days. It's Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday, basically. And some people started to say, if we did this in December instead, we have like 3 weeks of a holiday season, which makes scheduling it a lot easier, makes attending performances a lot easier. So for a couple of decades, people were starting to do both. Sometimes you'd hear it on both weekends. They would do it in December sometime, and then again in April or March, if that's where Easter fell. But that maybe was just a little bit too much, in fact. And because of the flexibility and the longer holiday season in December, gradually over time, it just made more sense to do it then, and that's where we see more and more performances happen. Lastly, I mentioned part 1, part 2, and part 3. Well, part 1 basically tells the prophecy of the Messiah arriving and his birth. So it makes perfect sense to do just part 1, and if you've heard an hour performance or so of Messiah, chances are that's what you've heard, just part 1. And secret, the Hallelujah Chorus doesn't even come from part 1. The Hallelujah Chorus The most famous part actually is the end of part 2. So usually if you hear the Christmas portion, you hear all of part 1, and then they go and jump ahead and play the Hallelujah chorus and end with that, just because it's the most famous thing. Me personally, I've done that, certainly. Sometimes I grab the Trumpet Shall Sound, which is actually from part 3, and you include that, and then we do Hallelujah chorus. So you kind of hear all kinds of different amalgams of the different parts, even if you hear the so-called Christmas version. Even during Handel's time, it became more and more popular, and he certainly attended many, many performances of it. In fact, we know that 8 days before his death, he attended a performance of Messiah, and he was actually completely blind at this point, so he only was able to listen, and as far as we know, we think that might have been the last performance that he ever attended. And Handel was incredibly wealthy at the time of his death. His estate, I think, was 22,000 pounds, which is in the millions today, easily. He was a very wealthy man, and he gave away most of his money. He was buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, which for a German is kind of a huge thing. I myself have visited it, and seeing his grave there was actually really moving for me. I knew that it was there, but so I was definitely looking forward to seeing it. But to have a German buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey really gives you an idea of how important he was to the English at that time to be included in that very, very special space. So over time, Messiah has kind of taken over the holiday season and really become a holiday tradition. But I hope what you've enjoyed today has kind of given a little perspective about what the actual tradition of it was. It's really an amazing piece, regardless of when it's performed. I think it'd be kind of nice to hear it maybe during Holy Week, because it's another wonderful time, and maybe when people aren't expecting it. If you have gotten this far on this video, there is a like button below. I hope you will click it. And if you've gotten this far on this video, there is a subscribe button below. I hope you will click that as well. We're glad to share this music with you, and we hope to see you soon on an upcoming episode. Until then, take care. One quick story about Handel. I mentioned some of these huge egos of the singers that he was working with. Well, there was one soprano who kept saying, oh, I want to sing it this way. And he kept saying, well, I wrote it this way. And she kept saying, well, I want to sing it this way. And he said, well, I wrote it this way. And she said, look, I'm the star. This is how I'm going to do it. And Handel was so livid that he went up to her and he said, Madam, I know that you are a she-devil, but I need you to know that I am Beelzebub. Then he threatened to throw her out the window if she didn't sing it the way he wanted. Little story about Handel.